Okay, I'm Matt Carbonello, and I'm here with my father, Joseph Carbonello. And today we're going to be talking about, does disco really suck, and the in and outs of disco. We are blessed to have my dad be this old and get to have gotten to experience the disco era himself, and also the eras that predated disco, including rock and roll, of course. But we're going to ask him some questions, and we'll get started. So, Dad, uh, when do you recall disco starting? What era?
Hi, Matt. Before we get started, I just want to preface what Matt had to say earlier or clarify. I may be old as dirt, but I'm not that old, and I certainly don't look my age. I'm actually going to be turning 62, and of course, everybody thinks I look way younger than that, and probably act a lot older. So, to
Yeah.
answer your question, Matt, thanks for having me on your show today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I didn't have any other choice.
You didn't have any other choice. I guess I was the one that you could afford. Yeah, what I recall is way back in the day. I mean, I grew up in the 1970s, and I recall disco, starting to have impact on music at that time. And at the time, I really didn't know what to expect. I mean, I was young, and it was kind of fun to go to places where there might be girls, whether it was disco or rock and roll. But I do remember I was part of a kind of a Christian-based organization called the Knights of Columbus, and we put on, dances. And I can recall trying to decide what or have input on what kind of music to play. And I wanted to play all kinds of Beach Boys music because I really liked the music, like Fun, 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 Surfing Safari and other Beach Boys songs. And basically, I was told, no one's going to want to dance to that because everything's going disco. And this was when I was about a sophomore in high school, maybe 74, 75. So that's what I recall about my first experience with it. And I just didn't like it because it started to transform, going away from music that I really liked to music that was, well, even back then when I was very young, not very appealing, but try to go along anyway.
Okay, so how about later on? Did disco kind of fizzle out, or was it something that had staying power? Or
Well, this was when it was first coming on the scene, probably around 1974, 75. I remember that was high school, time frame, but it wasn't fizzling out. In fact, it was getting more and more strong. There was still great bands. My favorites like Led Zeppelin, The Grateful Dead, Santana, and just a whole slew of other, hardcore, rock and roll purists. But disco is definitely starting to make its way into the music scene. And what I recall in particular is when I went to college. I went to college out at I'm from the east part of the state of Massachusetts, Saugus, Mass, which is just north of Boston. So it's a little bit more urban, suburban area. And then I went to a rural area out in Western Mass where, basically they were influenced by the Grateful Dead. I mean, they were basically a mainstay kind of band out there. And they just loved the old kinds of purest types of music. And it was even more so than what I like, the Creedence Clearwater vibe, Jonathan Winters and a bunch of others that they just really, really enjoyed. But I remember going to places I started to really see some differences. I can remember going to some of the college bars, and they'd have a place called the Pub, where it was on Thursday nights when I was a freshman and a sophomore, and there was just basically two guys playing this band called Two Way Street, and they played Van Morrison, they play all the classics, rock and roll, and we'd have a ball. It was an absolute blast, dime beer night, and it was just full of, like I said, purest rock and roll, hardcore kinds of music, and it was just so much fun. And then by the time I was a junior, that Thursday night had changed into a disco night. And it was such a real bummer, to say the least, because we'd gone from something that was just let your hair down, have a great time, good old fashioned drunken, party, to slick back hair, people wearing chains, and it was just more of this glitzy kind of environment.
So it's just a style and a fad kind of thing.
It was definitely a style of a fad.
Always couldn't be enough.
Yeah, no, it felt a lot more shallow going to these places as opposed to the purest and rock and roll. And we got to the point where we were kind of making fun of it. I mean, sometimes because, again, we were looking for girls, we were chasing girls, and we go to any place where there were girls. And if it meant we had to go to a disco, well, we went to the disco. I just never really adjusted much because, quite frankly, I thought the girls were part of that scene, were shallow. Lots and lots of makeup, lots and lots of...
So what are some positives of disco?
Well, before we go there, I'm not done with the negatives.
I mean
I can remember
cut you
going
off.
at UMass Amherst and then coming back to like I said, the eastern part of the state, and some of my old friends seemingly had changed because they were adapting to the that way of being. There was a lot of polyester. I remember seeing lots of those leisure suits that they were wearing, lots and lots of polyester, lots of chains, lots of slick back hair. And it really, I thought, I just said, what's going on here? It was really disturbing, but again, chasing girls. At that time, if you were under 21, you could still go to the night bars, and almost everything was disco in the making. You know, there was not a lot of rock and roll places to venture. So to get along, you went along. And again, not really a positive environment, but we did it anyway. But some of the things, though, that I do recall, though, that was probably a positive. There was a great movie called, maybe you remember, I think everybody saw it, the one with John Travolta called Staying Alive. And I think it showed the good, the bad, and the ugly of disco music and the whole scene of disco. I think I wasn't sure if the music really, I mean, that movie served more to promote disco or to dissuade disco, because certainly John Travolta demonstrated what a fabulous dancer he was, and there was a fair amount of technique to it, a lot of discipline and a lot of skill that was involved with dancing in that movie. But conversely, it also demonstrated the shallowness of that scene, where there was people going to those bars just simply drinking, trying to pick up girls, having one-night stands, and doing all the wrong kinds of things. And I also remember John Travolta's brother in that movie, showing what a bad scene it was, or what the negative scene it was. His brother, who was a former priest, going to it and just saying, this just isn't my vibe. You didn't really expect this of me, did you? And his brother, John Travolta, would say, yeah, I think we kind of did. I was hoping you would enjoy this. But as it went through the movie, though, again, you saw some fabulous dancing. And it was. I think that was a positive. But again, also the negative side of it, because there was a young man that was killed in the movie by just trying to get along and try to be part of that shallow plastic environment. So you saw a lot of that downside also. But I think some of the positive of the movie also, though, is that I remember the Bee Gees had a couple of songs in that movie. One was, Staying Alive, and, How Deep Is Your Love. And they had a few others in that song, which was very, very good. And the Bee Gees, I mean, it seemed like they had been a mainstream band that kind of morphed into this disco band during that era. So on one hand, they sold out, but on the other hand, they had great harmony. So I thought that was a positive, this part of this disco. In fact, I remember buying that album because I actually liked that kind of music. I thought it was very, very catchy and very listenable. What else do you want to add? I think through it all, I thought I stayed. I kept to my roots, which was embedded in the original music, or the hardcore music, the basics of things like Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Grateful Dead, Led Zeppelin, Santana, Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, all that kind of music. I held my ground on. In fact, I'd be going out with my friends, and at that time, of course, there was cassette tapes, and I would make my cassette tapes while they were listening to some disco. They try to force that on me, and I basically would, force my music on them. And ultimately, what I think is kind of interesting is that my kind of music, or the music I love, kind of won out. I mean, the vintage music that I think you hear a lot of today is still that music that has different changes in it. It seems like it's more sophisticated kind of music with guitar riffs and, like I said, different changes. And that's still, prevalent today. So I think overall disco, overall was a good, bad. I think the bad overall, I think, outweighed the good of it. It was an interesting time in my life, but overall, I wasn't pleased. I think it was some things that it was an experience. I lived through that experience, but I wouldn't want that again. I just think that the whole vibe was overall a very shallow one, very simplistic one, and one that I wasn't grateful for. Just one other note: there were a couple of bands that were my purest that I was kind of disappointed in. There were the Grateful Dead and Shakedown Street. It seemed like they were, as they were going, that last album, or the album that had Shakedown Street, seemed like it had a disco vibe to it, which I didn't appreciate. And it seemed like that time that they were kind of going that way. And, ultimately, it didn't seem like that kind of music, stayed with that group. Same thing with the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones a song called Miss You was kind of had that disco vibe to it that I didn't appreciate at that time. But fortunately, it seems like they went back to the original, the original hardcore driving beats and the different changes, and that's the kind of music that I enjoy. And again, overall, I think it was an interesting time. But does it suck? I'd have to say, in retrospect, yeah, 90% of it sucked. It really did. I think 99. I'm even going to venture to say, even with the Bee Gees, even with the great dancing that evolved, I'm going to say about 99% of it at the end of the day just genuinely sucked. I guess if there's any redeeming value, it made me appreciate hard, the music roots that I had even more so. And one more note is I'm really pleased that my son, Matthew, is really a brilliant guitarist, and he loves the music that I grew up on. In fact, he listens to more of the stuff that I listen to, which is the purest kind of rock and roll. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Thanks, Dad. Well, that's going to wrap up our Disco Sucks interview. Thanks for listening. See you next time.